January 14th, 1944. Dawn over northern France. A line of silver-grey fighters cuts through the clouds, massive, heavy, unlike anything the Germans expected to see at 25,000 feet. The air is brittle with frost, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Below, the ground is a blur of black soil and frozen fields. Above, the contrails twist into thin, white scars. In the lead formation, 8 P-47 Thunderbolts climb hard against the rising sun. Their propellers slice the air with mechanical fury, each aircraft carrying the weight of nearly 5 tons, guns, bombs, and the thick armor that makes them look more like flying fortresses than fighters. Radio chatter breaks the silence. Enemy contacts inbound. The pilots grip their throttles. One calls out, calmly, almost detached, "Tally-ho." Moments later, the sky erupts. Flak bursts bloom in the cold air. German fighters dive in from the clouds. The P-47s roll, turn, and answer with 8 50-caliber guns each, a wall of fire tearing through the sky. It's brutal, efficient, and unstoppable. The era of the Thunderbolt has begun. The war in the air is changing, but few yet realize just how much. In 1939, the world was once again unraveling. Europe was burning, and the United States, though not yet at war, could feel the tremors from across the Atlantic. The skies over Poland, France, and later, Britain had become laboratories of destruction. The age of the propeller had reached its most lethal form. Air supremacy was no longer a luxury, it was survival. The American air doctrine, however, was still mired in theory. The U.S. Army Air Corps believed wars would be won through strategic bombing, fleets of heavy bombers flying deep into enemy territory, destroying the enemy's industrial heart. Fighters were an afterthought, small, light, and short-ranged. Their role was to defend bombers near home, not to escort them across continents. By 1940, as the Luftwaffe dominated Europe, American designers faced a brutal realization. Their existing aircraft were obsolete before they ever saw combat. Planes like the P-36 Hawk and P-40 Warhawk were fast for their time, but they lacked the altitude, speed, and firepower to challenge German Messerschmitts head-on. In this crucible of desperation, a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli, working at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, began sketching a new concept, something that defied convention. Kartveli's philosophy was simple: survivability over elegance. He envisioned a fighter built not for grace but for endurance, a machine that could take punishment, deliver overwhelming firepower, and still bring its pilot home. It would be heavy. It would be powerful. It would be, in his words, a flying engine with guns attached. The first design he proposed was the XP-47B. When presented to the U.S. Army Air Forces, many were skeptical. The aircraft's projected weight was staggering, over 13,000 pounds, nearly double that of a Spitfire. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a massive 18-cylinder radial that demanded more fuel and space than any fighter before it. But Kartveli refused to compromise. To protect the pilot, he added layers of armor around the cockpit. To ensure survival in a dogfight, he equipped it with 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of firing over 3,400 rounds per minute. To offset the drag, he designed a massive propeller, a turbo supercharger, and a reinforced fuselage that could withstand incredible stress at high altitude. By late 1941, as Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the US entered the war, the prototype XP-47B was finally ready. Test flights proved the skeptics wrong. Despite its bulk, it could exceed 400 miles per hour, climb to over 40,000 feet, and dive faster than any Allied aircraft. When the test pilot landed after its first successful flight, his words were simple: "This thing climbs like a homesick angel." Still, doubts lingered. Many in the Air Force considered it too large and cumbersome for combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the new North American P-51 Mustang seemed sleeker, more modern, better suited for the kind of air combat people imagined. Yet, the world the Thunderbolt was built for was no longer theoretical. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was fighting a brutal campaign over Europe. Bombers flying daylight missions into Germany were being slaughtered by Luftwaffe fighters. The losses were catastrophic. Pilots needed a fighter that could go the distance, survive heavy flak, and still fight its way out. The Thunderbolt was ready. It entered service in early 1943, first with the 56th Fighter Group, stationed in England. The men who flew it quickly gave it nicknames: the Jug, short for Juggernaut. At first they cursed its weight and slow climb. But once in battle they realized something extraordinary. This plane could dive through a storm of gunfire, take hits that would destroy any other aircraft, and keep flying. In the deadly calculus of air combat, the Thunderbolt's philosophy of survival began to prove itself. Its presence would soon alter the entire strategic landscape of the air war. By mid-1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had transitioned from an experimental curiosity to a frontline weapon of the US Army Air Forces. Across England's newly constructed airfields, rows of the aircraft stood gleaming in metallic silver, each one representing the industrial might of a nation that had turned its factories into engines of war. Every rivet, every inch of armor plating, every round of ammunition had a purpose. The United States had committed itself not just to producing planes, but to producing endurance. And the P-47 was endurance made flesh and metal. Production at Republic Aviation accelerated with staggering speed. The plants at Farmingdale and Evansville turned out thousands of units, each powered by the Pratt Whitney R2800, a 2,000-horsepower engine that would become one of the most successful power plants of the war. This engine didn't whisper, it roared. Its sound was unmistakable, deep, resonant, and intimidating, often described by ground troops as the thunder that preceded salvation. Despite its size, the Thunderbolt's performance numbers shocked pilots. Its turbo-supercharged engine allowed it to maintain power even at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where thin air sapped the strength of most fighters. In combat dives, it could exceed 500 miles per hour, faster than almost any aircraft in the Allied inventory. And in the vertical, the domain of life and death, nothing descended like a P-47. But for every advantage there were challenges. The plane's range was limited. Its first missions barely reached the western edges of Germany, forcing bomber crews to fight unescorted deep into enemy territory. The Army Air Forces demanded more. Republic responded by fitting drop tanks, external fuel pods that extended its reach into the heart of the Reich. It was a turning point, not just for the aircraft, but for the air war itself. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was flying thousands of Thunderbolts over occupied Europe. Escort missions over the Ruhr, Bremen, and Hamburg became routine. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable in its own airspace, began to feel the weight of a new kind of adversary, a machine that refused to die. German pilots who engaged Thunderbolts quickly learned to respect them. They might outturn the American planes in a tight horizontal fight, but if a P-47 dived, nothing could follow. Its pilots used this to deadly effect, climbing, baiting, then plunging downward in controlled fury, guns blazing. When the 50 caliber rounds struck, the results were devastating. Aluminum peeled back like paper. Behind every sortie was the logistical miracle of American industry. At its peak, Republic Aviation employed over 20,000 workers, most of them women, producing nearly one aircraft every 40 minutes. By the end of the war, over 15,600 Thunderbolts would roll off the assembly line, more than any other US fighter type. The P-47's bulk also made it a natural platform for secondary roles. Ground crews fitted it with bombs and rockets, transforming it from a high-altitude escort into a lethal ground attack machine. Where other fighters struggled under heavy loads, the Thunderbolt thrived. It could carry 2,500 pounds of ordnance, nearly as much as a light bomber. By 1944, the Allies had found in the Thunderbolt something more than a fighter. It was a shield for the bombers and a hammer for the ground. When Operation Overlord loomed, the invasion of Normandy, the Thunderbolt stood ready. It would strafe rail lines, convoys, and armor. It would dive through anti-aircraft fire to destroy tanks and fortifications. It would become, in many ways, the most feared sound German soldiers could hear overhead. Yet even then, it never enjoyed the glory of the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was sleek, fast, and photogenic, a pilot's plane. The Thunderbolt was the soldier's plane, ugly, heavy, unglamorous, but unbreakable. And in the crucible of total war, that difference mattered. The next phase of its story would reveal what made the Thunderbolt not just powerful, but indispensable. From the men who flew it to the enemies who faced it, the men who flew the Thunderbolt were not born with romantic notions of aerial glory. By the time the P-47 reached Europe in force, the air war had already stripped the shine from the idea of heroism. Bomber formations were torn apart by German fighters, return rates dropped to 50%. For these young men, many barely 20, the Thunderbolt was not just a weapon, it was insurance. From their first encounters they realized what it could endure. Flak holes in the wings, cannon shells through the fuselage, oil streaming across the canopy. Still, it flew. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group famously returned from combat with over 200 bullet holes in his plane, one cannon shell lodged in the engine, and an enemy fighter still on his tail. The aircraft landed. The pilot lived. Johnson stepped out of the cockpit shaking, drenched in oil, his life owed entirely to the thick-skinned brute of aluminum that had carried him home. Stories like his spread fast across England's air bases. Pilots stopped complaining about the Thunderbolt's weight. They began to trust it. They began to love it. In a war where death often came unseen, a flash, a burst, a spin into the clouds, the P-47 offered something almost miraculous, a second chance. The P-47 did not fight like other planes. It didn't dance, it struck. At over 8 tons loaded, the Thunderbolt was too heavy for classic dogfighting. Instead, it fought with speed, altitude, and firepower. American pilots were trained to exploit these advantages through a method called boom and zoom. Dive from above, strike hard, climb away, repeat. The tactic fit the plane perfectly. Its turbo-supercharged engine delivered immense power at altitude, while its weight made dives blisteringly fast and stable. A Thunderbolt could fall through a cloud deck at 500 miles per hour, unleash a burst of 8. 50-caliber guns, shredding enemy fighters or tearing locomotives apart, and climb back to safety before the enemy could react. Against the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s, it became a predator. The Germans called it der Sterrock, the battering ram. They knew it couldn't be outturned, but it couldn't be outdived either. And every time they followed one downward, they often never came back up. In escort missions, Thunderbolts learned discipline. They guarded the heavy bombers through the deadliest part of their runs, the approach to targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Berlin. Luftwaffe fighters tried to break through in waves. Thunderbolts met them head-on, carving into the attacks with walls of tracers. It was a new form of air warfare, methodical, mechanical, merciless. And beneath its thunder there was purpose: protect the bombers, finish the mission, come home alive. Every war machine develops a mythology. The Mustang was beauty and speed. The Spitfire was defiance. The Thunderbolt was endurance. But to the men on the ground, friend or foe, it was terror. German infantry on the Western Front learned to recognize its sound before they saw it. The deep growl of the R-2800, the descending scream of its dive, and the erupting storm of machine gun fire that followed, these became symbols of impending annihilation. Its arrival could halt a column, scatter convoys, and paralyze defenses. The Luftwaffe feared it for different reasons. Reports from German pilots in 1944 reveal a grudging respect. The heavy one does not die. Its armored cockpit absorbed damage their cannon shells could not always penetrate. Even among Allied pilots there was a psychological shift. Flying a Thunderbolt changed how they perceived risk. In other fighters, one hit could mean fire, failure, and death. In a Thunderbolt, there was the belief, almost superstition, that it would bring you home no matter what. Confidence became a weapon. And confidence, multiplied across hundreds of squadrons, changes wars. Behind the Thunderbolt's strength was not just design genius, it was industrial capacity. Republic Aviation, under the leadership of Kartveli and the relentless pace of wartime America, achieved something unprecedented. Factories ran day and night, producing aircraft with machine-like rhythm. Women mechanics and riveters, Rosies of the Republic plant, assembled fuselages as test pilots roared overhead in completed models. Engineers streamlined production lines to deliver thousands of aircraft across the Atlantic, packed in crates, reassembled on British soil. The logistical scale was immense. Each P-47 required over 200,000 parts and 9,000 man-hours to construct. By 1944, one rolled out nearly every half hour. It wasn't just an airplane. It was proof that American industry could turn raw material into strategic dominance. Republic's workers never saw combat, but their precision became the unseen armor of the pilots who did. Every bolt tightened in Farmingdale or Evansville translated into survival in the skies over Europe. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a triumph of organized will. By 1944, these human, tactical, psychological, and industrial forces had fused into something greater than the sum of its parts. The P-47 had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of a nation's ability to endure, adapt, and overwhelm. But there were still deeper layers, in technology, leadership, and legacy, that would define what truly made it underrated. At the heart of the Thunderbolt was one of the most remarkable engines of World War II, the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial powerhouse, it produced more than 2,000 horsepower, a level of output that only the most advanced piston engines of the war could sustain. Unlike the liquid-cooled Merlin engine that powered the P-51 Mustang and the Spitfire, the R2800 didn't rely on vulnerable coolant systems. One bullet through a radiator could cripple a Mustang. The Thunderbolt's radial could take shrapnel, leak oil, and still grind its way home. This resilience became its mechanical signature. But the genius lay not only in raw power, it was in the turbo supercharger system that Cartvelli built around it. The Thunderbolt's massive rear fuselage housed an intricate network of ducts, turbines, and pipes that compressed high-altitude air into the engine. This gave the P-47 full power even above 30,000 feet, where most engines gasped for oxygen. The complexity was immense. Maintenance crews called it plumbing with wings. But when it worked, and it often did, it made the Thunderbolt a monster in the vertical plane. Pilots learned to exploit this, climb high, dive fast, strike hard. In a single burst, 8 guns could spit over 13 pounds of lead per second, shredding anything unlucky enough to be in the crosshairs. This brutal efficiency was not elegant, but it was decisive. And in a war defined by industrial scale, elegance didn't win. Output did. Every great machine needs champions. For the Thunderbolt, they came from within the ranks of the U.S. Army Air Forces, officers and pilots who saw through its bulk and believed in its potential when others dismissed it. One of the earliest believers was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the famed 56th Fighter Group. Zemke understood what the P-47 could do if used correctly. He trained his men to fight on their terms. No tight turns, no theatrics. Altitude, energy, discipline. His pilots learned to fight with mathematics, not muscle. The results were extraordinary. Under Zemke's leadership, the 56th became the highest-scoring U.S. fighter group in the European theater, credited with 665 enemy aircraft destroyed. Zemke himself scored 75 kills before being captured late in the war. Another believer, General William Kepner, fought bureaucratic resistance to keep Thunderbolts in frontline service even as Mustangs arrived. He knew the P-47's role was shifting, from air-to-air dominance to ground attack supremacy, but he refused to let it fade into obsolescence before its time. These leaders shaped doctrine that would influence U.S. air combat for decades. They proved that survivability and firepower could win wars just as decisively as speed and agility. When historians later compared statistics, one number stood above all. Pilots flying Thunderbolts suffered fewer losses than any other single-seat fighter group in the U.S. Army Air Forces. That was not luck. It was philosophy turned into hardware. To German troops, the Thunderbolt was a nightmare that came from nowhere. By 1944, as Allied air power began strangling supply lines across France, the P-47 became the face of destruction. Ground soldiers called it the Jabot, short for jag bomber or fighter bomber. They feared its sudden descents, the thunder of its guns, the whistling scream of its dive brakes. German armored divisions learned to scatter at the first sound of its engine. The Thunderbolt's rockets and bombs could reduce a column of tanks to twisted metal in minutes. In Normandy and during the Falaise pocket, entire units reported being decimated by what they called Thunderbolts of Hell. Luftwaffe pilots, too, adapted their tactics. Reports from German ace Adolf Galland described the P-47 as formidable in the dive and nearly invulnerable to gunfire. They tried ambushing from below, but the Jug's high-speed dives and durable frame often made it impossible to finish. The Thunderbolt's reputation reached even into propaganda. German broadcasts warned of unstoppable American attack planes, and civilians along the Rhine began referring to them simply as the Brutes. For a weapon dismissed early as too heavy to fight, this was vindication written in fear. War creates its own myths. The Mustang became the hero's chariot, fast, elegant, immortalized in photos and films. The Thunderbolt never enjoyed that narrative. It was too blunt, too industrial, too practical. But among those who lived through the air war, it represented something deeper, a machine designed not for glory, but for return. Survival was not glamorous, but it was moral. Every pilot who came home meant fewer telegrams sent to mothers and wives. The Thunderbolt was built for that purpose. It protected life by overwhelming death with armor, horsepower, and relentless firepower. In its way, the P-47 embodied the industrial morality of America's war effort: build strong, save men, win by endurance. The war would soon test that morality to its limits. In the skies over Normandy, in the Ardennes, in the frozen desperation of 1944. And when that test came, the Thunderbolt would not just survive it, it would define it. June 6, 1944. Dawn, Normandy. Operation Overlord had begun. The largest amphibious invasion in history was unfolding beneath a grey, smoke-streaked sky. Allied bombers thundered overhead, battleships pounded the coast, and above it all, unseen by most soldiers below, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt roared into the heart of the storm. From the first hour of D-Day, the Thunderbolt's role shifted forever. No longer just an escort fighter, it became the hammer of the Allied advance. In low-altitude sorties, often below 1,000 feet, P-47 squadrons strafed beach defenses, artillery positions, and German armor moving toward the invasion zone. The Jug, once built for high-altitude duels, was now the Allies' most devastating ground attack aircraft. By the end of June, thousands of missions had been flown over France. Each sortie carried bombs, rockets, and the relentless weight of .50 caliber Fury. The effect was transformative. German columns moving by day were annihilated. Rail lines were torn apart. Bridges collapsed in smoking ruin. The Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver was shattered not by tanks or infantry, but by American fighter bombers cutting arteries from the air. It was here that the Thunderbolt's heavy frame became its strength. Diving through flak, it absorbed punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Pilots came back with wings shredded, oil pressure gone, control cables frayed, yet somehow still flying. One airman described it simply: "The Jug takes hits you don't even feel until you're on the ground." The P-47's devastating combination of ordnance and firepower turned it into an aerial artillery piece. Pilots used dive-bombing angles of up to 60 degrees, releasing 500-pound bombs with precision, guided only by instinct and experience. When bombs were spent, they attacked with rockets, 4 or 8 under each wing, then strafed with machine guns until their belts ran dry. Entire panzer battalions disappeared under these attacks. The Germans adapted by hiding tanks in forests or under camouflage nets, but reconnaissance and air coordination were improving daily. For every trick the Wehrmacht devised, the Thunderbolt found a counter. The Allies began coordinating fighter-bomber groups directly with ground forces. Ike's Tactical Air Command became the nerve center of this new doctrine. P-47s flew close support for Patton's Third Army, striking ahead of advancing armor columns. Radios crackled with grid coordinates. Pilots identified targets visually, often within sight of friendly troops. The battlefield was no longer two-dimensional. It had gained a third dimension, and the Thunderbolt ruled it. In late July, during Operation Cobra, the Allies launched their breakout from Normandy. Hundreds of Thunderbolts filled the sky. They pounded German defensive lines south of Saint-Lô, opening a corridor for the US First Army. The bombardment was so intense that observers described the earth itself as boiling. In one afternoon, entire regiments of the German 2nd Panzer Division ceased to exist. The Luftwaffe, by then a shadow of its former power, could only watch. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and Allied dominance left them unable to contest the skies. For every German aircraft that rose, 10 Thunderbolts waited. The psychological impact was immense. Allied ground forces began marking their vehicles with bright recognition panels, not to protect themselves from German fire, but from friendly Thunderbolts overhead. "If it moves, shoot it," was the standing order. By the autumn of 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the spearhead of Allied air power. Its pilots transitioned effortlessly from escort missions to ground assault. striking with a precision and ferocity unmatched by any aircraft in the theatre. As the Allies pushed east toward the German frontier, one campaign would push the P-47 and its pilots to the limit, the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Ardennes, snow, fog and confusion. The German counter-offensive slammed into Allied lines, catching them off guard. Tanks poured through the forests, villages burned, American infantry fought desperately to hold. The weather grounded most aircraft, and for days the Thunderbolt sat idle, engines frozen in their shelters. But when the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, the reprisal came swift and merciless. Squadron after squadron of P-47s took off from Belgium and northern France, diving through the winter haze. They struck columns of German armor, fuel convoys and artillery positions. The Thunderbolt's guns ripped through steel and snow alike. One of the Luftwaffe's last offensives, a desperate attempt to reverse the war's course, was stopped not just by Allied soldiers, but by the relentless hammering from above. In a single week of operations, Thunderbolts destroyed or damaged over 1,500 enemy vehicles. The German offensive stalled, crippled by lack of mobility and fuel. The P-47 had proven its ultimate purpose, not just a fighter, but a war-ending instrument of attrition. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of Belgium, it had become the airman's best friend, and the enemy's worst nightmare. The war was turning irreversibly against Germany. Yet the Thunderbolt's story was not finished. Beyond victory, there were moments that tested its pilots, its legacy, and its very place in history. By early 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had reached the apex of its wartime evolution. The Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on Earth, was collapsing. But even in its death throes, it fought with desperate intensity. And into that final fury, the Thunderbolt dove headfirst. The skies over the Rhine Valley became the proving ground for everything the aircraft had been built to do. Airfields in France and Belgium now pulsed day and night. Mechanics worked in freezing air, engines idling on makeshift runways slick with mud. Pilots, hardened by months of relentless sorties, strapped into cockpits streaked with soot and oil. Their missions were brutal in rhythm and purpose. Interdiction, close air support, rail destruction, and the unending hunt for the last fragments of German armor. The Thunderbolt's firepower turned every engagement into industrial violence. 8 heavy machine guns pouring fire into convoys, bridges, and depots. In these final months, a new tactic emerged, the armed reconnaissance. Pilots were ordered to roam deep behind enemy lines, seeking targets of opportunity. It demanded independence, quick judgment, and nerve. The Thunderbolt, rugged and self-reliant, was perfectly suited for it. Footage from gun cameras captured scenes that bordered on apocalyptic, trains erupting in fireballs, tanks spinning off roads, entire villages left smoldering. Pilots who flew these missions later said it was the closest they ever came to understanding the raw machinery of destruction. The aircraft's transformation from escort to destroyer was complete. But for all its might, the P-47 faced a silent challenge, one not born from combat but from comparison. The North American P-51 Mustang had entered the skies of Europe in late 1943 and captured imaginations everywhere it flew. Sleek, fast, long-ranged, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin and back. It looked like a champion and flew like one. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was heavy, blunt and loud, a weapon of endurance rather than grace. While the Mustang became the face of air superiority, the Thunderbolt's reputation slipped into the background. Newspapers and propaganda posters glorified the Mustang as the plane that won the air war. Few noticed that the Thunderbolt was still flying the majority of Allied sorties in the European theatre. Even the Luftwaffe's dwindling aces acknowledged both sides of this rivalry. They feared the Mustang in the chase, but they dreaded the Thunderbolt in the dive. In early March 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine, Thunderbolt groups delivered near-constant airstrikes on retreating German forces. Their attacks turned highways into graveyards of steel. The Wehrmacht's logistical system collapsed completely. Supply depots burned for days. In one operation near Remagen, P-47 squadrons were tasked with protecting the newly captured Ludendorff Bridge, the first Allied crossing over the Rhine. German bombers and artillery tried relentlessly to destroy it. The Thunderbolts held the skies, intercepting incoming threats and annihilating approaching convoys. The bridge survived long enough to allow tens of thousands of Allied troops to cross into Germany. For the soldiers on the ground, the sight of a Thunderbolt overhead was more than reassurance. It was survival itself. Infantrymen wrote home describing how the Jug saves us every time. By April, there was no doubt left. The Thunderbolt had been underestimated not because it was weak, but because it was too strong, too practical, too unromantic for myth-making. When the German surrender finally came in May 1945, many of the men who flew the P-47 were already being reassigned or discharged. Their aircraft, once symbols of raw power, were parked on airfields in long, silent rows. Some would be scrapped, others shipped to training bases, and a few sent across the Pacific for final combat against Japan. But the war in Europe had already been written in their wake. From its first flight in 1941 to the last mission in 1945, the Thunderbolt had flown over 500,000 sorties, dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, and fired over 135 million rounds of ammunition. It destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 tanks. No other American fighter came close. And yet, when peace returned, its legacy began to fade behind the more photogenic silhouettes of Mustangs and Spitfires. Still, among the men who had fought from its cockpit, there was no debate. They knew what had saved them, what had turned hopeless me, scions into survival, and what had quietly carried the weight of victory through the storm. For them, the Thunderbolt was not just a machine, it was a brother of steel, brutal, honest, and utterly reliable. As Europe fell silent and the wreckage cooled, the great engines of the P-47 wound down for the last time. Their sound, that low rolling thunder, faded from the air. But in that silence lay the proof of their triumph. They had done their work so completely that they had made themselves unnecessary. The war was over, but the reckoning of legacy, memory, and recognition was still to come. The guns fell silent. The skies cleared. Europe lay in ruin, a patchwork of bombed cities, smouldering factories, and shattered roads. Yet above it all, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had left a mark that could not be erased by peace treaties or headlines. By war's end, over 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built. More than 8,000 had served overseas in the European theatre. Their pilots had flown over 500,000 combat sorties, from the beaches of Normandy to the Ardennes forest, from the Rhine Valley to the plains of Central Europe. The numbers themselves are staggering. 86,000 rail cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks, and countless vehicles obliterated by bombs, rockets, and strafing runs. These figures tell only part of the story. For the pilots, the P-47 was more than statistics. It was survival. The plane's armor and rugged airframe meant that a pilot could return from missions that would have destroyed any other fighter. Casualty rates for Thunderbolt squadrons were significantly lower than for comparable units flying lighter aircraft. For every life saved, the machine reinforced its reputation as the airman's shield. Industrial output was equally decisive. At the peak of production, Republic Aviation employed over 20,000 workers, many women, producing nearly one aircraft every 40 minutes. The logistical effort extended across the Atlantic. Crates of wings, fuselages, and engines were shipped to England, reassembled by Allied crews, and thrust into battle with barely a pause. Every air victory owed as much to the factory floor as the pilot's skill. The operational versatility of the Thunderbolt became a defining legacy. Originally designed for high-altitude bomber escort, it evolved into a fighter, bomber, and ground attack Juggernaut, a role few other aircraft could fill. Its durability and firepower allowed pilots to conduct missions that ranged from air interdiction to close support, often in adverse weather or under heavy flak. By the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Thunderbolt had become indispensable. It destroyed German armor, disrupted supply lines, and directly saved thousands of Allied ground troops. Yet despite these achievements, recognition remained elusive. The P-51 Mustang captured the imagination of the press, the public, and post-war historians. Sleek, fast, and photogenic, it became the symbol of American air superiority. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was heavy, industrial, and unsentimental. Its victories were measured in destruction and endurance rather than glamour. Its pilots knew the truth. It was the workhorse of victory, not the star. Post-war assessments reveal a paradox. The Thunderbolt had arguably the greatest cumulative impact of any US fighter in the European theater, yet it was often omitted from the narrative of aerial heroism. Its kill ratios, ground target destruction, and survivability statistics were unmatched, but popular memory favored the Mustang and its mythos. Even contemporary films and documentaries of the era seldom depicted it. For the Luftwaffe, the P-47 remained a symbol of overwhelming American industrial and tactical power. Captured German reports analyzed its armament, armor, and high-altitude performance with a mix of respect and despair. They recorded that engagement with a Thunderbolt was often fatal. Pilots were outgunned, outdived, and outlasted. In every report, one phrase recurred: it could not be beaten by conventional tactics. At home, returning pilots tried to convey the truth. Letters, memoirs, and after-action reports all testified to the aircraft's durability and lethality. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, noted in his post-war writings that the Thunderbolt was the only aircraft in the US inventory that could survive repeated combat damage while remaining fully effective. The Thunderbolt's legacy extended beyond Europe. While the focus shifted toward the Pacific theater, the aircraft continued operations against Japanese forces, performing bomber escort missions and ground attack sorties. Though overshadowed by carrier-based fighters in the Pacific, the P-47's presence contributed to the final strategic dominance of Allied air power worldwide. By the spring of 1945, the Thunderbolt had proven every element of its design philosophy. Endurance, firepower, and industrial scalability had not just kept it relevant, they had made it decisive. Even as it faded from public memory, its influence persisted in doctrine. The combined lessons of durability, tactical flexibility, and survivability informed the design of post-war fighters and shaped US Air Force strategy for decades. The stage was set for the final reckoning, the quiet acknowledgement that the P-47 Thunderbolt, unglamorous yet lethal, had altered the course of aerial warfare in ways few had understood at the time. As Europe transitioned from war to reconstruction, the Thunderbolt's influence became apparent not in headlines or statues, but in strategy and doctrine. Post-war analysis by the US Army Air Forces highlighted the aircraft's unique contributions, unsurpassed durability, versatility, and firepower. In the 8th Air Force, studies confirmed that missions flown by P-47 units suffered significantly lower pilot casualties than those flown by other fighter groups. This was not a fluke, it was design philosophy turned into battlefield reality. The aircraft's ground attack record reshaped American tactical thinking. The P-47 demonstrated that a fighter could double as a tactical bomber, delivering devastating ordnance with surgical precision while remaining survivable. This principle influenced future fighter-bomber designs like the F-84 Thunderjet and F-100 Super Sabre. The lessons of armored airframes, redundant systems, and high-altitude power management became embedded in American military aviation doctrine. Yet, despite these contributions, public memory largely overlooked the Thunderbolt. A Mustang or Spitfire, it lacked cinematic allure. Its massive fuselage, blunt profile, and low-speed takeoff characteristics made it appear ungainly. Even among veterans' memoirs, the P-51 often overshadowed the Thunderbolt, despite the latter's operational prevalence. Historians have since recognized this disparity, labeling the P-47 as the most underrated American combat plane of World War II. In Germany, intelligence reports captured the aircraft's psychological impact. Luftwaffe assessments referred to it as the Juggernaut, capable of absorbing damage that would destroy any other fighter. Wehrmacht ground units noted the terror of the sky, particularly from strafing and rocket attacks. Enemy operational planning had to account for the Thunderbolt, diverting resources simply to survive its presence. Technologically, the Thunderbolt set benchmarks that endured beyond World War II. Its R-2800 engine demonstrated the potential of high-output radial power plants in combat conditions. The turbo-supercharger design showed that aircraft could maintain high performance at extreme altitudes. influencing jet engine development. Its 8-gun armament and ability to carry bombs and rockets presaged the concept of the multi-role fighter, a standard in post-war air forces. In human terms, the plane's legacy was equally profound. Pilots who returned from missions over Europe often recounted how the P-47 gave them a fighting chance when none seemed possible. Stories of survival after catastrophic damage circulated widely among crews, creating an enduring ethos. In the Thunderbolt, pilots trusted their lives, and the machine did not fail them. Even after the war, many P-47s were repurposed for training or shipped abroad. Some served in France, Brazil, and other allied nations. They trained the next generation of pilots in the principles of survivability and tactical versatility. The lessons learned from the Juggernaut persisted, quietly shaping air warfare doctrine even as the Cold War dawned. The paradox remained: the aircraft that had arguably contributed the most to the success of the US Army Air Forces in Europe was largely absent from popular memory. Its power was raw, functional, and unromantic. Unlike the Mustang, it never inspired posters or propaganda, yet it shaped the outcome of entire campaigns: Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the push into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt story concluded not with fanfare but with a quiet, undeniable record of effectiveness. It had flown more sorties, destroyed more targets, and saved more lives than most of its contemporaries. Its pilots returned home, its factories shut down, and the aircraft itself receded from public view. But the imprint it left, on doctrine, on the air war, and on the men who relied on it, was indelible. The war had ended, but the lessons of the Thunderbolt endured. Endurance, firepower, versatility, and survival over spectacle, these became hallmarks of American air power. Its legacy would survive in the jets, strategies, and doctrines that followed, proving that even the most underrated machine can determine the course of history. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt ended World War II not with applause, but with results. Its legacy is measured not in fame, but in function. In the thousands of lives saved, the enemy convoys destroyed, and the unbroken record of sorties that carried Allied forces from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. It was a machine of extremes, massive, armored, and loud. It lacked the elegance of the Mustang or the Spitfire, yet in its bulk lay its genius. The Thunderbolt embodied a philosophy that valued survival and impact over style, a philosophy that turned attrition into advantage, endurance into victory. Every dive, every strafing run, every armored cockpit was a calculated answer to the demands of total war. In the human dimension, the Thunderbolt was a crucible. Pilots learned to rely on its resilience, to trust its raw power, and to execute tactics that emphasized control, patience, and precision. The stories of men returning from missions riddled with flak, yet alive, speak to the plane's moral and practical purpose: to preserve life while delivering destruction with certainty. Technologically, it represented the apex of piston engine innovation, a radial engine capable of unmatched altitude performance, a fuselage that could absorb punishment, and weaponry that made it a walking arsenal in the sky. Its design philosophy influenced the post-war generation of aircraft, laying the groundwork for multi-role fighters that dominate even today. Yet its greatest lesson is philosophical. The P-47 teaches that success in warfare, and perhaps in any complex system, is not always glamorous. Power and resilience, applied consistently, can achieve more than elegance or speed. Recognition may follow later or not at all, but the impact remains measurable, undeniable, and permanent. The Thunderbolt story is a quiet testament that even the most underrated industrial and unglamorous tools can shape history when applied with vision, discipline, and courage. Its engines no longer roar, its guns have fallen silent, but the shadow it cast over Europe in the last years of World War II remains. A reminder that strength, when properly engineered and deployed, speaks louder than myth.